Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 9. The Systemic Mind. The universe is a systemic world organized by a governing body of intelligences that enjoy eternal status beyond death. Conscious thought contact with this intelligence network activates full awareness of the human mind, pinpointing its psychic and psychological origins, both structural and mystical. Conscious thought contact with entities that evolve beyond the astral form is re-establishing the irreversible and cosmic fact that human unconsciousness is the subjective reflection of a non-integrated psychic communication circuit. This partnership, that had degenerated throughout the involutionary phase of ego development, that is, its advance from the astral to the lower mental stage of humanity, lives a reversal in the supramental evolution of consciousness within the boundaries of the physical body. Regardless of the polarized movement of the evolutionary pendulum, from the left to the right, from superstition to short-sighted rationalism, the fusion of the egoic with its cosmic principle is taken in stride. The time necessary to achieve its position of balance. Contact with interdimensional intelligences is a new fact of life and represents a new man beginning his long trek back to creative freedom from unconsciousness. The major concentration of intelligence activity and life in the universe lies beyond the spectrum of visible light, on either the astral or mental plane of systemic reality. The fallacy of civilization lies in its rigid intellectual or naive and spiritual dogmatism versus the interpretation of universe reality. This causes us to overestimate our intellectual probity and covet the emotional security offered by theological speculations that remain a measure of what we want to believe within the preset limits of our historically conditioned faith and its social rituals. And we have so come to underestimate, absolutely, the presence of unchallengeable dynamics of an intelligence-based cosmic order that manifests itself through the complex web of interdimensional influences acting through us just beyond the threshold of our so-called conscious mind. The evolution of the mind in the foreseeable future will come from a profound and real understanding of the absolute relationship that binds us, albeit unconsciously and since time immemorial, to other planes of intelligence. The mind cannot and will not achieve full development until it outgrows religious and scientific prejudices implanted in the involutionary phase of our planetary development and experience. Until then, we will pursue our blind participation in a systemic communication network whose full access has been short-circuited in man since the dawn of biblical history. The universe is peopled by civilizations so advanced as to plunge the uninitiated into a maelstrom of contradictions and disbelief that would dwarf the most far-fetched science fiction. Were he confronted with the objective revealing power of the mind without preparation, the mysteries of life would shock his consciousness and lead to the collapse of his normative functions and, consequently, give rise to acute existential distress. The uncluttered mind is a perfect channel through which conscious awareness of the reality of interdimensional worlds is possible. Following the full realization and understanding that unconscious personal thought processes are simply primary veils that hide the cosmic dimension of life, intelligence and civilized evolution. However, the unnatural pride and narrow-mindedness of self-centered consciousness is of such magnitude as to make it literally impossible for a race to grow into the knowledge and science of things that extend beyond its psychological threshold, until its individual members have freed themselves from the cultural indoctrination that conveys and maintains, through historical inexperience on a mass scale, the body-mind illusion. The full potential development of the mind must include the conscious telepathic element in order to advantage the self over the lower illusory forms of mental speculation as to the nature of metaphysical dimensions that extend beyond physical appearances. The mind grants full explanation of the mysteries whenever the self is ready and willing to proceed beyond the body-mind illusion. A new mind psychology is the only way to be able to impart to the self the science of the occult mechanisms of its own evolution, and that of thought science in general. Thought communication with the universal circuits is the basis for a new and creative understanding of intelligence and its source. Once consciousness has been adjusted to the interdimensional fact of thought reality, the mind generously offers to the self that which lies beyond the intellectual barriers of egocentric consciousness. Telepathic communion with pre-personal thought increases the field of knowledge and instructs in the science of things to come. The previously unimaginable notion of cosmic politics becomes reality when the self sees through subjective thought and where it really comes from. As the unfolding of the mysteries takes place through a natural and growing mental awareness, the thinking self abandons the presumptions and short-sightedness of its purely intellectual positions. Ignorance is a state of mind that falls short of an objective perception of reality, and lacks the psychological and psychic maturity necessary to dissociate mental perception from the astral memories that restrain interdimensional awareness. Politics are as present and active beyond the visible spectrum as they are within the physical dimension of life. The fundamental principle of such activity is derived from the law of necessity that subjects the organizational power of intelligence, whether seen or unseen, to the evolutionary needs of the socio-political evolution of consciousness. On Earth, cosmic politics are a vast unknown, due, in part, to the limited awareness of human consciousness. Regardless of this fact, They influence mankind's socio-political achievements. Religions, for example, are an integral, though unconscious part of cosmic politics and have had a lasting influence on mankind. The appealing emotional nature of their doctrines has charted the path of evolution and raised human awareness to a more or less homogeneous level of feeling and understanding within specific environments, but has failed to bring objective scientific knowledge of the mysteries and of the creative forces at work behind the physical constructs of civilization. Once the subjective, conditioned opinions about universe reality are shed, the magnitude of life and its hidden components will become evident through a non-polarized mind empowered to lift the veils on its vast, multidimensional hold. The physical sciences have eradicated superstitions and displaced the center of religious beliefs, but have failed to eliminate the short-sightedness inherent in purely intellectual analysis. We have moved from superstition to empirical science in the study of matter, but have failed to move from superstition to science in the study of thought, a prerequisite for the understanding of the mysteries. The mind in its personalized form, actualized through the brain, generates electromagnetic sounds called thoughts. When its electric potential is raised through conscious understanding and inner refinement of the thought process, it becomes more expansive and capable of revealing occult facets of reality unattainable in the less vibrant forms of conditioned intellectual behavior. The universe in its visible and invisible state can be studied and understood when objective mental freedom has been achieved. The mind is a magnetic phenomenon. When the mind of a civilization has been formed through the historical process, individuals are forced to conform to notions that may or may not conform to reality. Therefore, the inheritance of real forms of knowledge reduce the impairing effect of sanctioned ignorance and its consequences for the evolution and growth of conscious understanding. Mass thinking alienates the mind and retards self-growth. Today, advanced nations are splitting at the seams of their collective consciousness as citizens feel increasingly estranged from themselves. Mental pathologies are on the increase at a time when science has raised abundance quantitatively to a level never achieved before in the history of civilization. Unless a parallel growth in awareness occurs, damage control may, in time, become an unmanageable task as individuals slide imperceptibly towards psychic disequilibrium. The consciousness of a nation cannot stray too far and for too long from a healthy and uplifting development, or it grinds to a halt. The masses then become the bearer of the national guilt, as their respective members are engulfed and magnetized through the negative process of psychic depression of the collective mental and emotional bodies. Those in power are aware of the delicate fabric of social consciousness. The intent of their politics forever complies with the need to maintain social stability and supplies a perpetual effort to better ensure it. With time, this task will become more difficult as new forces emerge to expand the mind in minute ways throughout the world. As consciousness accelerates and moves from the collective to the individual, society will threaten individual evolution less, and a new growth factor will bring into focus the connection between the physical and the psychic dimensions. The mind will gradually develop into a new center of force. A new age will dawn, and man will never be the same. Culture has never been globally befitting to the revealing powers of the mind. The few who have witnessed its reality were forced into secrecy, their experience buried with other secrets of the ages. The mind is not what it has generally thought to have been. As a controlled interdimensional expression of psychic forces that move through the individual, it masks a powerful cosmicity. Historically, it has been framed and contained within psychological conventions, waiting for man's entry into an ascendant evolutionary cycle or new age. Civilizations are, and always have been, protected from the power of the mind's occult forces, which has prevented their untimely collapse. The collapse of civilization as we know it is already in progressive development. The historical junction of the new mind and contemporary civilization is a matter of timing, and is beyond human interference. The unbound manifestation of the mind cannot take place in a scientific vacuum. Modern science had to precede the paranormal development of mind beyond its astral connection. As science progresses and pushes the frontiers of material studies further, human inquiry into psychic studies is also stepped up to establish a much-needed kinship between the material, astral and etheric domains. At this stage of evolution, the mind remains an unconscious and unintegrated expression of the subliminal rapport with interdimensional intelligence. In its higher and more powerful forms of creative expression, commonly called inspiration, great men have felt its unexplained authoriality and often paranormal nature, but have failed to relate to it beyond their subjective appreciation. Sensitives have threaded spiritual innocence into its psychic fabric, unable to fully understand its inner laws beyond the cloudy conventions of astral extrapolation. We fear or are bemused by the psychic interdimensional continuum that comes to life once the self has attained a certain level of mental evolution. We do not possess as of yet the necessary tools that would enable us to deal appropriately with the astral influences that color our mental perceptions. forcing us into a constant and delicate disequilibrium caused by the presence of different non-integrated planes of intelligence interacting with our psychological values. But once the astral veils have been shed, consciousness of self alters sufficiently and the mind becomes a vast reservoir of creative energy under the guidance of a higher pre-personal force that makes itself felt from the mental ethers, free from the lower dimensions of astral memory. When the mind is in perfect balance on its mental plane, it reaches stratospheric heights wherein the self is instructed in the science of life, death, personal and universe evolution, with all its worlds and inspiring, regenerating knowledge. It expands the academic virtues of the intellect and voids the naive spirituality of the ignorant ego. The opening of the mind channel goes hand in hand with the evolution of a cosmic order. The consequences for man are such that it cannot be fully appropriated until a sufficient need arises. The law of necessity is prevalent in the raising of the mind to a higher mental level. The awareness of a pre-personal mind connection brings into evidence the fact that correspondences exist between the physical, astral, and mental planes which must, in due time, be brought into conscious experience. The forces of evolution will then be realigned to allow the evolved elements of the race to pursue the path that meets their psychological and psychic needs. The mind is not simply an arena where thoughts are generated, but a channel for conscious thought contact with other levels from where the tremendous powers of cosmic intelligence direct the evolutionary forces of life on the globe and beyond. It is important to note that man has little in-depth, objective knowledge of its mechanisms beyond the intellect. Whatever he knows or thinks he knows is but a limited fragment of intelligence that partakes mechanically in the primary make-up of self-reflection. As computers evolve generationally, so will the human mind. When computers attain the 7th generation, man will have come into conscious rapport with other levels in the universe through thought communication. As long as scientific proof is needed to assess reality, the mind is overruled by the senses and intelligence remains unattainable. The mind is a channel in an objective sense of the word, and the objective perception of this reduces the coloring of the thought process by astral forces, and releases consciousness of self from soul domination. The mind naturally vibrates to the universal dimension, and its psi level can be brought within the reach of self-awareness once it has objectified its relationship and perfected its link with pre-personal life currents. This link with interdimensional intelligence cannot be explored until the self has come to terms with the illusion that thought comes from the personality. The ascendance of modern physical science has rumbled through the halls of theological dogmatism. The same will take place in the postmodern era when the dogmatism and status quo of materialistic sciences are disturbed in turn by realizations that transcend their fundamental principles. Psychological complacency goes hand in hand with the need not to disturb the hard-driven fact that life is too short to be changed, while we easily infer that time is its own caretaker. Man is not opposed to new knowledge but to the temporary discomfort it creates. The exploration of the laws of the mind will create the shock needed to dislodge age-old egocentric attitudes. This radical change initiates contact with notions that bring human consciousness to the cosmic fact of interdimensional communication with planes of reality that have always been, in the past, legated to the spiritual realms of the afterworld. There is no other truth further from reality when death represents only the spatio-temporal vacuum of the personality after the soul has left the physical envelope. Beyond death, the universe evolves through the help of macrocosmic intelligences and highly definable powers whose scientific knowledge of the universe and its laws has been the pillar of the architectural evolutionary orders since the dawn of life. They have maintained their collaboration with the human race in a continuous, ascending effort to free man from the enslaving influences of the souls of the dead on his mind, steadfast asleep. The mind is the traveled path of thought through mental ethers that correspond to light dimensions or worlds akin to our own but differing in density. The postmodern age will break the chains of the psychological illusion that presents thought as a strictly personal phenomena. A logical illusion maintained through centuries of ignorance of the mysteries. We have for thousands of years been burdened with the inalienable fact of their insolvability, and we have never recognized the inner freedom and power to explain them away through the creative activity of the unpolluted mind. The mysteries are nothing more than the psychological boundaries created throughout history by blind acceptance and accumulation of egocentric notions, out of fear of moral or psychological castration. Such fear is a moral constant, experienced when the mind develops a dependency on historically sanctioned absolutes, maintained to act as anchoring points for subjective and cultured ideas, at the expense of real mind freedom. Man must create his own inner revolution to evolve. It cannot and will not come from the outside. Outside revolutions are but the result of an inner need for freedom, misguided because of the inability of the self to break its own beloved chains. We regard consciousness as a state of mind. In fact, it is an instant amalgam of pure intelligence and soul memory in proportions that vary in accordance with the evolutionary status of the soul. Both principles converge to create in man his dual nature, human and cosmic. The former is familiar as psychological suffering corresponds to an existential condition extensively colored by fundamental and historical ignorance of the laws of the mind. The latter has yet to confront, universally, human awareness, since it corresponds to the outer dimension of reality to which the soul is bound beyond the astral plane of death. The soul is but one aspect of the human dimension, while the higher self or double represents the other. Both must, in time, unite to be able to ordain and put into motion the process of consciousness. Man is the terminal of consciousness, the soul its memorial aspect, while the double, or spirit, governs the whole gamut of energy that springs from the universal pool of forces directing the evolution of life forms. All must, through evolutionary development, form a creative triad against which the astral forces of death are powerless. The psychology of the mind as it relates to thought identity is still in its infancy and universally unknown. This is due, in part, to the fact that human nature has been governed and manipulated by astral forces grafted to a realm of consciousness cut off from the mental planes from which it originated. The scourges which have befallen mankind since time immemorial were imparted through the unconsciousness and ignorance of the ego. The irreducibility of this fact can easily be tested and verified through the study of psychic communications and revelations divulged by intentioned entities whose presence is veiled to the intellect. In the universe of the mind, violence comes from the death world, because these entities feel cheated out of life. Their only recourse lies in the unsuspected ability they share in manipulating human nature. Whenever they can, they magnetize the mind through the emotions experienced by the soul in evolution. They know they cannot evolve beyond a certain point in astral form, and that their return to Earth is subject to cosmic laws that cannot be transgressed. Time for them is suffering, until they have achieved, through successive evolutionary cycles, the status of fusion or unity with their individual thought source, or double, under whose guidance alone, unadulterated consciousness becomes permanent and unhindered in its form and purpose. Short of this, the soul in the flesh is influenced, and in many cases ruled, from the astral plane to which it is karmically bound through an extensive memorial and experiential past. The higher selves or thought adjusters are intelligences whose role it is to infuse human consciousness with thought vibrations that correspond to the evolutionary status of their respective souls. They seek potential conscious unity or fusion with the soul as the latter progresses towards the final phase of the incarnational process. They evolve in worlds of their own that correspond to our mental activity. Their presence throughout the universe is awesome, and their permanence in time is beyond our limited comprehension. Their evolutionary activities have all to do with the conscious development of the mind. Thought adjusters are beings of light in their own right. They have never and never will partake of physical evolution. Theirs is so advanced as to form the basis of the mysteries that have plagued human consciousness since the dawn of history. Through the evolution of a higher consciousness and the development of a creative psychology of the mind directly transmitted from a supramental plane of consciousness, the self gains access to ideas that cannot be intellectually speculated on. Supramental psychology frees the ego from the burden of the subjective imagination and allows the development of a freer thought contact with mental planes from which the highest level of creative thought is made available in the present cycle of civilized evolution. The workings of the mind become perfectly understood when the self is freed from concepts that shackle it to the body-mind illusion. The fact that the mind is a phenomenon of thought communication wherein ideas or thoughts flow in and out instantaneously when a time gap between the ego and the higher self is bridged, will then appear objectively real. The concept of the thought adjuster is essential to the understanding of the occult facets of the thought process. Without such key knowledge, it is impossible to break free from the illusion of self-thought and gravitate towards more encompassing notions of reality. The symmetry of the mind must be broken up in order to bring out the particular aspects that can be treated through a conscious dialogue with its source. The mind activity must become a dialogue or process of communication where the relationship between the recipient and the donor become one. The physical illusions of the body-mind relationship can then be overridden when the self realizes a fact that cannot be set aside through the reflex action of the lower mind, the intellect. The revolutionary knowledge of supramental intelligence will allow access to vistas larger than the imagination. As science progresses inexorably, so will the mind. Inquiries of a new order will force themselves upon consciousness in order to harmonize material scientific advances with the astral and mental sciences that pertain to interdimensional space and time. New notions will surface to round off the rough edges of scientific thinking, fostering the need for mental growth beyond the limits of self-thought. The need for a higher and all-encompassing understanding will be felt, at first within more individuated, mature members of the race and in time, at the mass levels where culture levels off the psychological and psychic forces that drive nations. This new cycle stretches over a period of approximately 2,500 years, after which mankind will begin its Jupiterian evolution. No longer in need of a physical vehicle to pursue the cosmic encounter with other civilizations and universes.